Okay. John Arnone was born in Ontario and earned a BA in journalism from Ryerson University. John has traveled a very long way to be with us here today. He lives in Victoria Harbour, which is on Georgian Bay near Midland. During his career, John worked as a reporter and editor in Saskatchewan and Ontario, and in 1987 was named AJAC Canadian Tourist of the Year, a prestigious national writing award. He then embarked on a 3-decade career as a communicator in the automotive and aviation industries in Canada and the United States. He and his wife, Tamara, have an amazing daughter, Terry Ann. John likes languages, guitar, paddleboarding, and hockey. Above all, John is a passionate Beatles fan. Today, you will hear about his findings that reveal the incredible and untold story about the Beatles and Canada. Please welcome John.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's very kind. Thank you for having me here today. As Bob mentioned, I have come a long way. My wife Tamara, who is with me. We live in Victoria Harbour, Ontario. Have you been to Midland? Southeast part of Georgian Bay. So you probably are familiar with Victoria Harbour. I've done something that very few have dared to do. There are 8,000 books about the Beatles. Oh, I'm supposed to be here at Logan. And not one of them really delves into their unique history with Canada. Unique. You're about to find out just how unique that history is. My presentation is called The Beatles' Great Canadian Adventure.
Tell the computer.
That's okay. So
I keep forgetting to.
In my book, which is called Us and Them, Canada, Canadians, and the Beatles, published in Victoria, British Columbia. In my book, I set out to demonstrate the contribution of Canada and Canadians to the music, art, history, and phenomena of the Beatles as a band and as solo artists, but more importantly, what they gave us Canadians. So here's what I've learned. And I think I explained it a bit to our friends here who are actually originally from the UK. Well, you can say throughout most of the 20th century, but in particular, in the mid part of the century, we as a country, Canada, we were wedged in between Great Britain, our colonial masters, and the United States, our largest and most important trading partner. Britain, as we know, was ground zero for the Beatles, and the US sustained their fame, especially after the Ed Sullivan Show, February 1964, right? And that we, as a country, we held a middle power kind of status in the world, and guess what? That stretches to our relationship with the Beatles. The result? Canada and Canadians were front and center in volumes of untold and unheralded stories that are rife with a narrative that helped to shape the band and their music. I'm going to take you down that journey now. But I think I'll start with a reading, and for that I need my dear wife because I can't hold the microphone and read at the same time. Okay. I'm going to just read something from the opening chapter of the book. It'll help you to frame what I'm talking about and where it all began. Okay. Give me a moment here. Oh, I'm almost there. Oh, okay. Around the time I was born, a struggling, little-known bar and dance hall band made up of teenage boys and early 20-somethings from Liverpool, England, were dodging flying bar stools and beer bottles while ducking under metal tables from the wailing fists of drunk and disorderly Canadian soldiers. The band was called the Beatles, and they were playing away from home, the seediest city on earth. That otherwise insignificant piece of bar-brawling history involving the early Beatles and Canadian servicemen in Hamburg in 1961 was my jumping-off point for a book about the Beatles in Canada. It's very Canadian of me, and perhaps also of you, to fixate on what others think of us. And when I read about that bar fight, my thoughts turned immediately to a barely 18-year-old George Harrison. What must the junior Beatle have thought about Canada when presumably his first experience with anyone or anything Canadian involved a Donnybrook at Hamburg's top 10 club that was so large and so ugly that it was quelled only by volleys of tear gas? We're not so polite and orderly after all, are we, George? Well, you know what they say about presumptions. As I set out to re-click and reabsorb myself in the Beatles' history, it was soon clear that my presumption about Harrison was blown to bits. The youngest and most impressionable Beatle had a Canadian-born niece and nephew, along with a sister, uncle, brother-in-law, and first cousins living in Ontario and Quebec. And the boots he was wearing to kick bottles and glass off that stage were purchased at an Ontario haberdasher as a transatlantic gift. That Harrison wore Canadian boots to repel and kick away riotous materials fomented by the Canadian infantry during that Beatles performance is not a serious historical parallel, let alone enough to begin writing a book about the Beatles in Canada. But here's what is. During that same year as the bar fight, his superfan mother Louise was visiting relatives in Ontario. And the kicker, and the point where my jumping off point spiraled luminously into a state of bliss, Julian Lennon's grandmother, Lillian Powell, was actually living in Toronto at the same time. Come on, really? Yes, Harrison's mother and Lennon's mother-in-law were both in Canada the year their boys were brawling with Canadian soldiers 6,000 kilometers away in West Germany. And so it goes. The top 10 Frankus wasn't Lennon's first encounter with Canadians either. The Beatles founder nearly came to blows with the Vancouver talent scout in 1957. I can go on and on. But let's just slide through the rest of the talking. Thank you, Tamara. Okay, why write this book? Well, it's a sweet collision of my passions. My passions are twofold. My country, Canada, the country in which I was born, the country that my parents chose to immigrate to in the early 1950s from the south of Italy. They actually met in Toronto and were married as Canadians. And secondly, my other passion, obviously, is the Beatles. Also, I have noted that Canada's role is underrepresented in the Beatles' history. And I'll give you an example of that. In the year 2010, I was in London, England on a business trip. I was working with Bombardier Aerospace, and we were trying to sell regional aircraft to British Airways. And at $35 to $40 million a pop, when you're selling aircraft at that cost, it can take weeks of negotiation, right? So I snuck away to Liverpool. I was just bored out of my tree. I snuck away to Liverpool. I did the entire Beatles tour in Liverpool. And I landed at the mecca of Beatlemania, a place called the Beatles Story, and that's it there on your left. There are two Canadian references in the entire mecca of Beatlemania. One of them had the band playing at Maple Leaf Stadium. Have you heard of Maple Leaf Stadium in Toronto? I sure as heck haven't. The other one had their Toronto stop listed as an American tour. I thought to myself, two references to Canada, they're both wrong, or both at least inaccurate. I can do better than that. Hence my motivation. Okay, the book itself, the new edition is 390 pages, 11 chapters. There are over 60 images of which I either bought, fought for, or pleaded for licensing privileges. I have used over 200 sources, conducted 28 interviews, and I've been very lucky with publicity. I've had articles in some major newspapers, the Montreal Gazette, the Toronto Star, some regional papers across the country, some magazines. I've been on several podcasts, and that's me on CTV News not long ago. Got very lucky with that. Okay. Canada and Canadians appear as bookends in the Beatles' lives and careers. think of the arc of their career, their early days, their formation, their fame, their breakup, their solo careers, and even their kids and now grandkids have Canadian connections. Do you see that chart? Sort of middle left? Can you see that? It's actually a music chart. Do you remember in Toronto we had the chum charts? Okay, that's a music chart from Grand Prairie, Alberta. Grand Prairie, Alberta. At the time, in March of 1963, the population of Grand Prairie was 9,707 people. March 1963. How does a Beatles song get on the music chart from Grand Prairie, Alberta? March of 63 was 5 months before their first hit, She Loves You, and 10 months before the Ed Sullivan Show. How does that happen? It's remarkable. They were virtually unknown in the Western Hemisphere, rejected. Even Capitol Records, their record company, didn't want them signed on in North America, at least in the US at first, and gave Beatles songs and licensing to smaller record companies that had no distribution power and no marketing budget. Yet Grand Prairie has the song She Loves You, sorry, Please Please Me, on their music chart in March. I explore that phenomena again, early representation in Canada, long before they were even a known entity in the Western Hemisphere. And I can go on and on. Anything else I can speak about? Oh, those are the boots George Harrison, from the gift he got from Ontario that he wore. You see how he's wearing those cowboy boots? We've got bottom left there, there's George again with his Canadian-born niece and his sister. The Beatles' famous trip to the Maharishi in northern India for their meditation, where they wrote the entire White Album. There was a Canadian who had unfettered access to them and took some of the most intimate photos in their history. George Harrison's very first tour after the Beatles broke up. First stop, Vancouver, British Columbia. John Lennon's son has a Canadian stepdaughter, and it goes on and on. Okay, some examples. I mentioned that George Harrison's uncle immigrated to Ontario. His sister then moved to Ontario and Quebec, and the first Canadian-born blood relative of a Beatle arrives. Now, here's a good one. Bottom right. You recognize that fellow? Okay, my UK friends. Does the word Butlins mean something to you? Okay, what does Butlins mean?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Who said that? Thank you so much. Our historian. A holiday camp. Butlins is a famous holiday camp which most Britons can relate to because it was birthed at this time. That's Billy Butlin, the founder. Okay? Billy Butlin in this photograph is wearing the uniform, the coveted, respected, and honored uniform of the Canadian Army for World War I. Billy Butlin lived in Toronto as a child. He went to school in Toronto. He worked at Eaton's. Now, Eaton's back then had a big department store, or the beginning of the chain of department stores. And do you remember, does anyone know where the Eaton family had their compound in Southern Ontario? It was in King Township. In King Township. The Eaton family chose, very progressive thinking, to have their employees use up their summer vacation as guests of the family on the compound. So they set up a campsite on the compound in King Township. Billy Butlin, who was an employee of Eaton's, loved what he saw. He absolutely loved what he saw. He went on to lie about his age, joined the Canadian Armed Forces at age 15, fought valiantly in the killing fields of France and Belgium, returned to Canada, and decided to set off for the UK by way of the Dominion of Newfoundland. He set sail for the UK. Why? They weren't really handy in the UK. It really wasn't a thing. But he learned about it in his time at Eton, his time in Toronto. So he set up his first campground in Wales, followed by another 2, 3, 4, 10, 15, 20 throughout the UK, throughout Ireland, and the Caribbean. What does this have to do with the Beatles? All right. I'm sort of drawing you into the story, aren't I? Okay. Let's talk about 1954. The McCartneys, James, Mary, and their sons, Paul and Michael, decide they're going to go on a summer camping trip to one of Billy Button's campgrounds in Willows. Right? It's called Sneggis. The entertainment folks at these campgrounds wore red, scarlet red uniforms. Why? Because Billy Button, remember how much he enjoyed seeing the RCMP parade in the streets of Toronto. So he decided to put his red coats, his entertainment people, in the same uniform as the RCMP. And there was a talent competition at this campground. And it's the first time that Paul McCartney sang in public at age 12. So the first ever public display of Paul McCartney's talents occurred at a campground in Wales that was set up because of an experience the owner had when he lived in Toronto and worked with the Beatles family. That's a Canadian connection to the Beatles. It gets better. The last member to join the Beatles was Ringo Starr. Thank you very much. Well done, John. Ringo Starr, Richard Starkey, was the last member to join the Beatles. His band, before he joined, was called Rory's Warner and Hurricanes. They were playing at another one of the Button's camps. A World War II veteran, our hero, at another camp in England where Ringo was playing, when he got the call from Brian Epstein to say, hey, we need a drummer. I've got this outfit called the Beatles. Would you join us? He left Button's camp, drove to Liverpool, joined the Beatles. So Paul McCartney's first public appearance, Ringo Starr's last before he joined the Beatles, all had a Button's/Canadian connection. Are there any questions? I can tell the historians are enjoying this because you understand the research, right? This does not come naturally. This has to be dug. All right, the formation of the band. I mentioned that Canadians cover the entire arc of their careers, right? Right, this fella, top right, you won't recognize him. Oh, you might. Carol Levy. Carol Levy was raised in Vancouver. He worked at a radio station in the Okanagan Valley and went out to the Yukon, painted houses, worked in the lumber yard, and made his way back to Vancouver as a radio personality and decided to branch out. So he makes his way to the UK. So you're a Canadian in media, makes his way to the UK. He convinces the BBC. Oh, he was a hypnotist also in British Columbia. That's probably how he convinced the BBC that they need a talent show. The BBC agrees. Yeah, talent show, what a great concept. So the Carol Levy Discovery Show is born. All right, we have silver hair, slightly overweight, Canadian celebrity, the first of its time in the UK in the 1940s and 50s. All right. John Lennon is 15 at the time. His first band was called the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen, John Lennon's first band, decides he's going to try out for the Canadian Talent Scouts show. They get to the venue in Liverpool, they tried and they lost. Okay? John Lennon's second band. Don't have the Beatles here. We're now called Johnny and the Moondogs. Except that there's no drummer, it's just John, Paul, and George. All three playing guitars. And they're playing for another competition 2 years later, 1959, again, hosted by our Vancouver. They didn't win or lose because it was in Manchester and the last bus home to Liverpool was fast approaching, so they had to skedaddle before the judgment came. But that isn't the point, folks. The point is, we had a Vancouverite, first with John Lennon in the palm of his hands. Then he was played another hand, this time with John, Paul, and George in the palm of his hands. And they whittled away. They never became part of his Discovery Show or the fame and adulation that he could have given them. You don't find that amazing? If a Canadian with one and then three Beatles in the palm of his hands in the UK, and he let them go. It's a good thing. I'll tell you why it's a good thing. Because they weren't very good. They were not very good. Had they gone on to fame with the Canadian guys' talent competition, they might have petered out very quickly. They weren't writing songs yet. Their harmonies were good, but the singing still needed some polish. They knew maybe three chords of the guitar. They used to burp into the microphone. They used to fight on stage. And they drank beer while they were playing. So maybe our Canadian did the world a favor by not advancing the Beatles, the early Beatles, to something beyond what they eventually became. Are there any questions? Okay, the Beatles' very first album in North America had nothing to do with the United States. It was only released in Canada. All right. In fact, if you can see the album, top right, there are 4 quotes from Canadian media on that album, including the Ottawa Citizen. How rare is that? And nothing of the sort in the US. Who knows the guy in the middle there? Paul Anka. Good. This is a good group. You know, I hit my sweet spot in terms of demographics here today. So that's Paul Anka. And Paul Anka, as we all know, was Canada's first child star, I guess. And he was already touring as a teenager in Paris when he first saw the Beatles playing. The Beatles hadn't busted out of Europe yet. And he claims he contacted his management team in New York to have a look at the Beatles. And then he further claims that that's the management team that got them to Ed Sullivan and Carnegie Hall. So Paul Anka claims that he was a cog in the wheel that created the British invasion of North America. Paul Anka was born in Ottawa to Lebanese parents. You know that, right? Okay. Bottom right. Who are these lovely ladies at the bottom right? Okay, we've got 2 Beatles spouses. We've got Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. We have Cynthia Lennon, Lennon's wife. All right. Beatles music evolved over time, right? We went from She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hands to I Am the Walrus, Ooh Ooh Bajou, to Magical Nuclear, to Helter Skelter, to Strawberry Fields. Let me take you down because I'm going to Strawberry Fields where nothing is real and nothing to get hung about. What happened to She Loves You? What happened to the boy band? Any guesses?
Oh, drugs.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. What if I told you that a woman from Hamilton, Ontario, was a conspirator in the first acid trip taken by the Beatles? Cindy Deary and her dentist husband hosted John, Cynthia, George, and Pattie at their flat in Mayfair in London in 1965. They had some nefarious ideas in mind because they spiked the sugar cubes. Remember, we used to use sugar cubes for our coffee, right? They spiked the sugar cubes with liquid LSD, and they gave those 2 Beatles their first LSD high. Unbeknownst and unknowing, because it was all meant to perhaps lead to something else. They were furious, they were upset, they somehow packed themselves into Pattie Boyd's little Austin Mini and made their way to Soho, flying out of their trees. And it took them 8 hours to recover from this acid trip. But I will tell you though, John and George kind of liked it afterwards, and they kept doing it. And they got Ringo and Paul eventually turned on. And it's at that point that we see the evolution of their music and the new songwriting techniques, new production techniques, new art, new sort of texture to their music with the Rubber Soul album. And it was the gal from Hamilton, Ontario, who conspired to spike those sugar cubes with liquid LSD, the whole ballroom. All right, the Beatles films. We had Canadians involved in the Beatles films as well. Okay. film A Hard Day's Night, their first film, right, from 1964, featured a very long dance segment with a fella from Montreal. Okay, recordings. I was supposed to place the music for you. I'm going to just pass on that. Because I'm kind of speaking a little bit too much. But I will tell you that there are, first of all, the Beatles rarely allowed other musicians to come into their lair, into their recording studios. They were a very tight band, they're multi-instrumentalists, very talented, had a wide range of musical abilities. So it's very rare that these Canadians play on their records. These Canadians. You can barely see him, but Art Ellison is a sax player, tenor sax player, born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, but lived out his days in Courtney, BC on Vancouver Island. He played tenor sax on the Beatles' White Album. Jack Fallon played fiddle violin, also on the Beatles' White Album, which was Stratford, Ontario. This fella is a harmonica player as well. He played on George Harrison's first solo album, which was still a Beatle. And this fella played sitar also for George Harrison. He's a strong man. And the fella from Montreal, you recognize him? This is a good group. That is Eric Clapton. You recognize the guy next to him? You won't. It's his dad. Eric Clapton, the great guitarist, right? Who we revere in rock and roll history, was born of a Canadian father. In fact, his father was born in Montreal, and his stepfather is from New Brunswick. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4.5 Canadians playing on Beatles records, all right? In their solo careers, we know that the song Give Peace a Chance, the global anthem, right, at the time, was recorded in Montreal. John Lennon sat down with our Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in Ottawa. First ever extended discussion with a world leader by any rock star. Lennon chose Toronto to first perform without the Beatles while they were still Beatles. And as he's leaving Toronto after performing at Varsity Stadium in September of 1969, he says to himself and to some others, I think I can do this alone. The seeds had been sown for the breakup of the Beatles as a result of Lennon's time in Toronto. There's a few other things here. I won't sort of, I think I've mentioned those other ones. Okay, some highlights. There was something going on in the 1977 where a band from Toronto was widely mistaken to be the Beatles. There's some other stuff in there as well. Ringo and his All-Star Band, they come to Rama a lot. I think they've been to Niagara Falls as well. They use a lot of Canadian musicians. Remember, the book is about the Beatles and their solo careers as well. A Canadian inducted Paul McCartney into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That Canadian was Neil Young, born in Ontario, raised in Winnipeg. One of the last on-camera interviews that George Harrison gave before he died was during a Formula One race in Montreal. And have you been to Las Vegas to see the Beatles' Love, a beautiful Cirque du Soleil performance? Okay, we've been, my wife and I have been. That's entirely a Canadian choreographed and written performance. Okay, films, more films. This is, again, the ones in red are the ones that I'm talking about, so I'm gonna go to the one in red. Okay. Stephen Harper. We had a Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, for 9 years, Conservative Party, big Beatles fan. He's on a state visit to Tel Aviv. He's with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a ballroom to welcome the Canadian head of state. And all kinds of elite people, politicians, social business people in this room. Our Prime Minister, sees a piano. And he nudges Netanyahu and says, I'm going to try something. And all of the handlers are going, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? He starts playing A Little Help from My Friends on the piano. Right? Our head of state broke into a Beatles song while on a state visit, and he played a second one. How big of a Beatles fan was Stephen Harper? That's how big. For his 50th birthday, his wife, Doreen Teskey, arranged for the London police and his RCMP detail to stop traffic at the Abbey Road crosswalk in this photo. My book talks about people that, or interviews or quotes, people that you'll know. So you'll recognize Sam Murray, David Foster, Neil Young, Celine Dion, former Premier of Newfoundland, Danny Williams, Joni Mitchell. You'll recognize these faces more or less because they all had, these are famous Canadians who have a significant connection to the Beatles. But here's faces you won't recognize, and this is where I take a lot of pride. These are people that you probably don't recognize. These are people like you and I, people who stay more or less under the radar. We don't get our names in the newspapers, but we don't appear on television. Why? Because we're just ordinary folk. But as ordinary folk, we still had an influence on the Beatles. And not just ordinary folk from, the usual suspects, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. No siree, no siree. If I'm going to write a book about Canada and Canadians, it can't be about those three cities or Edmonton and Calgary. It has to be about the entire country at large. And that's what I've done. I have connections to the Beatles from all 10 provinces and one territory, the Yukon territory. And I'm talking profound connections, not just like, a marginal link to Charlottetown. No, I've got some really good stuff from Prince Edward Island as well. So I managed to make a truly national study of our links to the Beatles. Okay, I'm now going to give you 4 quick stories, but I'd like to get questions. Are there any questions at this stage? Yes, sir.
Beatles, Tom, wait just a minute. Let me get a microphone to you.
Oh, thank you, John.
The Beatles and Band, read the book.
It's a great question. Probably not. There are too many layers. There's too many layers of people between guys like me, a retired guy living, in the boonies, and the Beatles. Because when you think of the Beatles, there's 2 of them still alive, right? Paul and Ringo are still alive. They're even beyond British royalty in terms of their status in life. They are in a class by themselves. For a guy like me to penetrate those barriers, it's not easy. I'm getting close though. Ringo Starr played at Rama. My lovely wife surprised me with tickets at his performance at Casino Rama 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. Before the performance began, our tickets were way up, but I stood at the edge of the stage. So where John is more or less where Ringo's drum kit is. And his people were tuning instruments and getting ready for the band. And I'm like this, and I'm waiting. And I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. And it wasn't going to happen because eventually security said, dude, what are you doing? And they asked me to go back to my seat. But there was a very sympathetic woman in the front row, right? The front row seating. Or it's in here. And she said, I think I know what you want, but you're not going to get it. So how about I take a photograph of you trying to give your book to Ringo? And that photograph is one in my treasure collections of photos. So, but the day will come. The day will come. Thank you for asking. Yes.
A question about Liverpool and the Beatles. Liverpool is the most Irish city in England. As a result of the Great Famine, a lot of Irish immigrants came to England, and the city they came to first was the ferry between Liverpool and Ireland. So they came to Liverpool. Glasgow is the other one. And until 1964 election, the election purported those 2 cities on the basis of politics, of religion. And I'm just wondering, the Beatles connection, McCartney, was he an Irish background or Scottish?
I have a good answer for you. I have a very good answer for you. All 4 of the Beatles are descendants of Ireland. All 4 of them. George Harrison's family, North Belfast. Paul McCartney's mother, County Monaghan. John Lennon's name was O'Lennon from the west of Ireland. And Ringo Starr had family in County Mayo. All right.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you for doing that, John. This fella, his name is Bruce Decker. He is in Winnipeg, and on their first North American tour, the Beatles needed a fuel stop between London, England, and their first stop in San Francisco. They played at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. What sort of smack dab in the middle of Winnipeg? So they stopped at Winnipeg Airport for a fueling stop. Word gets out on the radio that they're doing this, and people start to gather. Now, the Beatles never played Winnipeg, but they're the Beatles, and they're getting fuel at our airport, enough of a reason to go crazy, right? This is Beatlemania for you. A young man named Bruce Decker, 17 at the time, was on his way to the beach with his friends. That's why he's wearing cut-off shorts, bare feet, and a striped top on his way to the beach. They make a course correction when they hear the radio announcement that the Beatles were going to be stopping for fuel, and he runs onto the apron of the airport where their aircraft is parked. It was a Lockheed Electra. And he climbs up the air stairs and pokes his head, and the Beatles are laughing their asses off. And of course, you have the Mounties taking them away. My book doesn't stop there. I wanted to learn more about Bruce Decker. All right? I spoke to his brother Robert in Oakville, Ontario. Bruce Decker not just made headlines in the Winnipeg Free Press and across the country in something called Decker's Dash, right? Not only did he make headlines for that, he became a member of the Guess Who. Oh, pretty good notch in your career belt. Didn't last long, so he moved on to other things. He wasn't happy with the way the Indigenous history of Manitoba was being told. So he took it upon himself to manage the rebuilding of Fort Gibraltar. Fort Gibraltar was an Indigenous village. He managed the rebuilding of that to preserve our Native history. Still not satisfied. He's helping an older couple move from their home in Winnipeg, and they couldn't pay him. So they found some interesting boxes in the attic from the previous owner of this home, and they give them to Bruce as payment. In those boxes, collodion plates. Do our historians know what collodion plates are? Collodion is the precursor process for photography. It's before negatives, where you'd have a sheet of glass and you'd sort of smear it with a cocktail of chemicals. You'd expose it to light, and boom, it would register the image. What were on these collodion plates? This is a nearly century-old technology for process. Bruce learns how to process these black plates, and what does he find? Some of the earliest images of our country, pre-Confederation, rural scenes, work scenes, homesteads. This is a beautiful thing. Forests, land. Some of the earliest images of our country, pre-Confederation, are thanks to this fellow who raised up the air stairs to greet the Beatles as a 17-year-old. Decker's Dash. Seem to have lost our register here. Okay, while Johnny gets this fixed, I'm concerned about time. The next slide is called A Pair of Saltstons. What are the odds that two men named Saltston, both Canadians, had a profound effect? Thank you so much, John. On the history of the Beatles, I'll make it quick. The fellow on the left, I mentioned him, was the one who happened to be heartbroken in New Delhi in 1968. When he found out that his girlfriend back in Montreal had broken up with him, he decided he needed to learn to meditate, to get over his loss, to get over his malaise. And so he decided to meditate with Maharishi up in Rishikesh, up in the Himalayas. And who's there? But the four Beatles. So we are a Canadian meditating with the four Beatles. He ended up coming back with the most intimate photographs ever taken of the boys. And he's made 3 movies and written 2 books about it. That's Paul Saltzman. Herschel Harry Saltzman on the right. Herschel Harry Saltzman from St. John, New Brunswick. Has a bit of wanderlust in him. He decides to leave home to join the circus. Somehow parlays that into an education at the Sorbonne in Paris. Somehow parlays that into becoming a talent scout, and then somehow parlays that into giving us the first 8 James Bond movies. That's a Canadian Harry Saltzman. It was Saltzman Rockley, Eon Productions, right? The American Tubby Rockley and Herschel Saltzman, Harry Saltzman. In 1964, Harry Saltzman gets the script to the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night put on his desk. We have a New Brunswicker, producer in London, gets the script to the first Beatles movie. He says, no, thank you. He takes a pass. Another Canadian dissing the Beatles, right? It ends up being the most important, biggest money-making film of that year, okay? He then he's making his last Bond movie, Live and Let Die. Live and Let Die is the one where Roger Moore replaces Sean Connery as 007, right? He gets the song from Paul McCartney, Live and Let Die. And he says, I don't like this guy's voice. I don't think we should use the song, but get a woman to sing over it. Now, by this time, he's thinking, I messed up with A Hard Day's Night. I better not mess up on this one. So he acquiesces, and they end up using Paul McCartney's song. So you have a guy from New Brunswick, 2 important Beatles connections. Okay, the most beautiful story in the book is the story of Lillian Shirt. Lillian Shirt was a Cree in northern Alberta, who in the summer of 1969 was protesting the living conditions of Indigenous peoples in that part of the province. Her story makes headlines. John Lennon is in Montreal doing his bed in for peace. Remember that zany thing he did with his wife? He's reading the Montreal Gazette or the Montreal Star, 2 English language papers that were available at the time, and he reads about her protest. He asks his people to call the radio station in Edmonton, get her to the radio station so he can have a chat with her. She picks up the phone. She has no idea who John Lennon is. He wasn't going to explain himself. He's perhaps the biggest, most important rock star in the world at the time. But he does say this. He says to her, hey, listen, I want to help promote your cause. Tell me more about it, and I'll do my best to get the word out. She said, well, thank you. I don't really know what to say to you, but because I'm not a trained spokesperson. She's just a passionate Cree, right? So she defaults to her favorite prayer, a prayer her grandmother taught her in Cree. And she recites this prayer to John Lennon in English. Imagine that if there was no hate. Imagine if we loved each other. We loved one another. Imagine that there would be no war between us. John Lennon's greatest song, greatest composition?
Yeah. Stole
a Cree from northern Alberta, even if a morsel of her grandmother's words of wisdom inspired a Beatle to write his greatest composition ever, should make all of us shiver with pride. Mull of Kintyre, a Paul McCartney song. I'll make this really quick. That's a Canadian who played on it, by the way. That's John McCallum of Surrey, BC. He played on the song Mull of Kintyre. But the real story is this. When McCartney heard of the murder of Corporal Nathan Cirillo, do you remember that very sad day in our history, right? That lunatic killed him in cold blood at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Ottawa. McCartney's people hear about it. He decides he's going to play in Hamilton, and he wants Corporal Cirillo's regiment band, pipe and drum band, to play on that song in Hamilton as part of the country's mourning for the loss of our brave soldier. Beautiful story. Okay, now that was sad. Now we're going to have some fun. Who is that fella? No, that's me. That's me. But who am I shaking hands with? Yeah, that's William Shatner. That's our Captain Kirk, right? Born and raised in? You good. Born and raised in Montreal in Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. Okay. William Shatner decides in 1968, at the height of his celebrity, to record a Beatles song. He decides he wants to record Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Now, William Shatner is not really going to sing it, he's going to talk it out. And in his mind, it's a song about drugs, gotta be about drugs. So I'm going to talk this song out on this recording as if I was really, really high on something, okay? It turned out to be the worst recording in the history of mankind, mankind all right. All right. How bad was this Canadian recording of the famous Beatles song? Well, I'll leave that up to George Clooney to tell you. Yeah, that gets a lot of laughs. That's a genuine quote from the American actor. All right, a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Ontario. I'm the son of proud Italian immigrants. That's my degree. I'm very proud to say that there's a person in this room who has the same degree as I do, who graduated the same year. In fact, we're high school friends. Barb Myers. Hi, Barb. That's Barb there. She's a fellow graduate of the Ryerson Journalism Program. I've lived and worked in these places, Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Jersey, and Michigan. I had a 35-year career in journalism and corporate communications. And there's my lovely wife, Tamara, with me, and that's us with our daughter. Have you been to Bala, Ontario? This famous cranberry patch, right? That's us at the cranberry patch. I had some fun. So I'm really happy with the way the cover turned out. It's got the Beatles walking through, Yadgey Road, in the Maple Leaf. I'm really happy. But we had some other ideas for covers first, right? So those are the ones that got rejected, but I still think they're pretty good. I still think they're pretty good. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. Okay, so I'm a sort of a local, I'm an Ontario author. I would like your support if it's at all possible. The book is nearly 400 pages. The prices elsewhere are pretty insane. Even Walmart is $40 US. So I'll sign it today for $35. I'll sign it to you or to the loved one in your life who might be a Beatles fan. Think of it as a great birthday gift or a gift for an upcoming occasion. All right, that's the book there. $35 cash or e-transfer, please. And I mentioned it's a timeless gift. Also, I've done a few of these presentations all over the place. If you belong to any other business groups, I don't mind driving all this way. I just enjoy what I do. So please keep me in mind for any upcoming presentations. And that's supposed to say thank you and Beatle blessings to you all. Thank you so much.
My role here is to say thank you, John. And I like to add a little bit of personal thoughts to it.
Stop the screen share.
Sorry. Okay. Couple of thoughts. The hair on the back of my neck was tingling on one of the slides. And that was the Imagine one. That was a very, 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 there you go, important and impactful example of the work that you've done, the research you've done, and tying the around the Beatles and Canada. I don't think you'll end up working with Gail to do one on Hugh Gale to do one on Ireland, but this one on Canada is a major accomplishment. I think it works. The second thing is on the last slide that you had all about you. I think it might be interesting to also add your name as a contributor to Canada and the Beatles link, because the aspect of Canada is very, very important, and the links that you've joined together with are great. The last thing is we have a thank you gift.